shouted down by a group of 20 or 30, some of them students, some of them not students, located near the back of the hall. Even though President Ocker asked time and again for silence so that Sheikh Yamani could deliver his address, the belligerents in the crowd would not permit that. And they were shouting various things: traitor to the country, agent of Zion, identifying themselves as Saudi citizens. Several of them were forcibly ejected, and finally it became obvious that they were not going to let Sheikh Yamani speak, so the hall was cleared, and only those who had proper identification, that is, Landon Lecture identifications, press identifications, K-State student or faculty IDs, were permitted back in McCain Auditorium. That process has taken now about an hour, and the hall is once again very nearly filled. From our vantage at the back of the downstairs section, I cannot tell about the balcony upstairs. When the original lecture was started, the hall was full, and they in fact had turned a number of people away simply because the auditorium holds only 1,800, and those seats were filled by sometime before 10:30. The downstairs portion of the hall is full, and I assume that the upstairs portion is also full. In the interim, during this hour, while the crowd was outside, a number of the demonstrators, those who were not in fact taken away in police cars, and there were a half a dozen of them maybe who were forcibly ejected, that is, literally carried out of the hall, and I think they were carried away, taken away. Those that were not stood outside, gathered around them knots of people, and explained their position. They maintain that they are, for the most part, Saudi citizens. Some of them said they were not Saudi citizens. Some of them were not from Kansas State. In fact, as near as I could tell, most of them were not from Kansas State, although there were some who identified themselves as K-State students. It's difficult to get a handle on who they are because they refuse to give you their name, or in some cases even where they are from, saying they are in fear of the secret police of Saudi Arabia. So you kind of have to go by what they tell you. I talked to a number of them. One was from Jordan, 4 were from, or said they were from Saudi Arabia. 2 of those said they were students here at K-State, 2 said they were not, and that they had in fact come here. They attended a meeting with Sheikh Yamani last night, and their contention is that the House of Saud has siphoned off the billions of dollars in oil revenue, and that the majority of citizens of Saudi Arabia live in abject poverty and are subject to state police terrorism. They object to the fact that Yamani is here, but they say the demonstration was primarily so that their side could have an audience. Indeed, it got that. Most of the demonstrators were the subject of television interviews, and the major networks are here, or radio interviews. And those that were not involved in interviews were involved in discussions with primarily students who were waiting to get back into the auditorium. So from that standpoint, they did accomplish what they set out to do. Some of them maintained that there is a broader issue at stake, that it is a Muslim issue, and that the House of Saud represents an anti-Muslim front, and that it has pursued, in fact, a Zionist foreign policy. They're referring now to the Camp David Accords and the fact that Saudi Arabia has been a moderate in the Middle East negotiations that have been ongoing, certainly from the Camp David Accords and of more recent time. That accounts for the shouts from the hall that Sheikh Yamani is an agent of Zion. The rest of the dialogue, and it was lengthy, we had nearly an hour outside, and most of that time, at least I spent, talking with the dissidents. It is a rather rambling dialogue, a recounting of horror stories that they maintain are going on inside Saudi Arabia, and they say that they have no way of alerting the American public to this, that Saudi Arabia has billions of dollars, that is, the House of Saud does, and that they can commandeer at will the attention of the press of the world, and these dissidents say they cannot do that, so they had to resort to the tactics this morning that if you were listening, that you heard. We're going to try it all over now, and the official party has now come back on the stage in the King Auditorium, along with Sheikh Ahmed Yamani and the president of Kansas State University, Dr. Dwayne Auker. Dr. Auker is at the podium. We'll switch now for his introduction.
We regret the inconvenience, and we appreciate very much your tolerance. And we apologize to you, Mr. Minister. From what we have been able to ascertain, none of the hecklers were K-State students, and none were Arabs, or just simply none are Arabs. So that all will be aware, we have a number of our security staff and others at the doors and on the perimeter of the facility, and any heckler will be removed. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we continue. May I present Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani. Sheikh Yamani.
Thank you very much. I really want to apologize to you about the inconvenience which caused by my friendship to you. I wish I have a chance to spend some time to explain to you why this happened. I want you to know, as a friend to this country, that the policy of this country vis-à-vis our part of the world caused an accumulated amount of bitterness and frustration. And what you have seen an hour ago is a reflection of that bitterness. They are young, they are misled, and they feel so frustrated. I hope some little correction can take place in the American policy vis-à-vis the Middle East. You have a real interest in our part of the world, and you do have real friends in our part of the world. We hope that you can protect your interest and establish an even-handed policy. What we need is peace in that part of the world, and we are right now hopeful that for the first time in the American history, this present administration really wants to bring about a peaceful settlement where every single country can live in peace with the others. I'm privileged to come in this International Week, and I come from a country which believes in the international community, and we really proved in what we did in the past that whenever there is an international interest for the international community, we take that deep into our hearts. And the subject I want to discuss with you today is the oil prices. Control or a decontrol of the oil prices. Which is better? And as we all know that the pattern of economic life which exists today in the world outside the centrally planned economies can rarely be described as a purely free system. I come from a country which believes in the principles of free trade and private enterprise. These principles are not transplanted into my community, but rather deeply embedded in our Islamic tradition, which regard the human initiative as a fundamental will of God. In the words of the Quran, I quote, "He had subordinated land to your labor," unquote. Similarly, this country, the United States of America, is a firm believer in the free system, both for itself and for others. The free system has always functioned with admirable success and efficiency to the benefit of people everywhere. It is not a coincidence that I come at this moment to speak before this distinguished audience about certain aspects of energy. Our two countries not only share common principles of economic life, but are also among the largest world producers of energy, the utilization of which has been subordinated to certain swift variations of damaging consequences. At times, these changes have favored the interests of the oil producers. Those of the consumers were damaged. At others, the interests of the producers were damaged while those of the consumers were served. When a supply shortfall existed, prices were pushed to extremely high levels, leaving the consumers with a high bill to pay for imported oil. Conversely, when demand fell, prices tended to slide downwards, depriving the exporting countries of vital earnings essential for their development plans. In both instances, the price of oil tended to hurt one single party at a time. These oscillations may underscore the contention that the reason for the damage is the absence of a correct judging system under which the price would be set at an equilibrium of supply and demand. The fact that demand has risen and fallen sharply over the last 12 years is evidence enough that most of the time the price has overshot the equilibrium level in both directions. Let us examine some historical events in retrospect and see whether the contention is valid. During the 50s and the 60s, the price of oil was kept at a low level. During this period, it remained almost unchanged in nominal terms, which meant that its value depreciated in real terms. This was accomplished only because of the control exercised on production and distribution of this commodity by a group of international oil companies. Such suppression prevented the price of oil from finding its true market level as warranted by the upward movement of all relevant indicators, such as demand, output, energy productivity, prices, labor wages, and incomes. When the pricing power was restored to the owners of the oil resources, the price, which at one time seemed to have stabilized in the mid-70s, once again overshot its true value in the early 80s. At that time, the indicators, although not readily visible to analysts, were pointing in the opposite direction, namely declining demand, receding output, falling inflation, and stagnant real wages. Nonetheless, the price continued to rise. Market signals failed to reach the price setters, the OPEC countries, and pressure suddenly mounted to reduce price massively. What further complicated the situation is the role played by stock manipulation by those who built them up. It is commonplace now to retreat the well-known argument that oil stocks management had swerved 360 degrees in the fulfillment of its objectives. Instead of building up stocks when supply was abundant at cheap prices, the managers replenished their stocks to the brim during supply shortfalls and higher prices. Instead of drawing down stocks at periods of high demand and high prices, they are drawing them down now when demand and prices have fallen. Should we deduce from those past events then that control was a failure, and that the oil market should be left entirely free for inherent forces to guide the price towards equilibrium for the benefit of the world community? In fact, there is a school of thought which advocates this kind of approach. Let us try to verify this approach and see for ourselves what would be the outcome of its application. In trying to portray a reasonable scenario, our assumption should also be reasonable and consistent. First, it should be remembered that if a purely laissez-passer, laissez-faire system is assumed for the oil market, such laissez-faire must be assumed to apply to other energy sources, international trade, and all other relevant variables. This is essential if a meaningful evaluation is to be made. Under this background, let us assume that the oil market is left entirely free from any kind of control, and that its price fell to $15 per barrel. Then the following chain of events may conceivably take place in the short term. A, at $15 per barrel for the marker crude, the price of fuel oil could drop to $10 per barrel, undercutting American coal CIF, the Atlantic seaboard, by about $5 per barrel. Coal demand and eventually U.S. coal production would fall by about 2 million barrels per day of oil equivalent, as end users in the electricity generators industry shift back to fuel oil. B, costly U.S. stripper wells as well as new production may drop by another 1 million barrels per day. C, North Sea oil production, whose cost is about $15 per barrel on the average, is bound to decline by a further 1 million barrels per day. And D, coal imports to West Europe and Japan, whose cost is in the range of $19 per barrel of oil equivalent, may be entirely halted, shifting the resulting energy gap in favor of oil to the tune of 1 million barrels per day of oil equivalent. In sum, demand for OPEC oil will soon rise by an amount of 5 million barrels per day. The long-term effects may be summarized as follows. A pronounced decline in exploration and development of new fields. B, a pronounced reduction in gas supplies. C, a slowdown in the erection of new nuclear plants. In the financial sector, oil-producing countries, especially those with substantial foreign debts, may withhold their debt repayment or even declare insolvency. Surplus countries now in need for more funds may resort to the withdrawal of their reserves held in Western banks. Those banks and other financial institutions finding themselves squeezed between massive deposit withdrawals by one group of developing countries and failure in debt repayments by another are bound to collapse. International trade will also suffer as developing countries' ability to import goods from the industrialized countries is greatly weakened. In fact, most of the decline witnessed in international trade during 1982 came as a result of negative growth in oil trade. Should low prices be sustained for a few years, a new demand for oil will be generated from increased economic activity as a result of the rebound in the world economy, which now appears on the horizon. New demand, which may come on top of that which has been shifted from non-OPEC sources, may in a few years gather momentum and bring pressure to bear on the price once again, pulling it to new high levels. And the world may witness the emergence of a new cycle of volatile oil prices. In brief, history will repeat itself. Consequently, our scenario for freely determined market prices obviously has not brought about the desired solution. But if previous efforts to control the market have failed, and if a free market mechanism is also bound to fail, then what is it that will not fail? In answering this question, it should be remembered that oil is not an ordinary commodity like tea or coffee. It is a strategic commodity. If it is not guided properly, it is bound to create many difficulties of a non-economic nature. This element in itself is reason enough to create a feeling of an anxiety that renders its price extremely sensitive to supply security considerations, hence its extreme volatility. In dealing with oil, the market mechanism can provide the best criteria to determine its value, provided the element of volatility is created for. Volatility tends always to obscure the real value of oil as signaled by market forces. This blurring phenomena explains why control measures is the best in the past 10 years did not bring forth the right pricing decisions. This failure, however, is not proof that the concept of control itself is inadequate, nor is it the result of the failure of the free market system itself. Failure lies in the misinterpretation by the controlling body of the proper market signals relevant to the equilibrium price when they occur. The free market is extremely essential as a reference for indicating the true price. The existence of a controlling body is also necessary for setting out the right price as signaled by the market. It must also be assigned with the additional function of moderating volatility and psychological vagaries, which inherently permeate the market, particularly the spot market. Oil is too important a commodity to be left to the vagaries of the spot market or future market, or any other type of speculative endeavors. OPEC, despite its shortcoming, is still the best body to assume the role of price setter. Mistakes were committed in the past, but they will serve as a lesson in the future. When I talk about control, I do not mean cartelization. Control, even under the freest of market systems, is resorted to frequently as a moderating tool of certain wild market forces. Recent history of economic life abounds in examples of administrative intervention in the market of all levels. High interest rates that were introduced more than 2 years ago did not come about as a direct consequence of demand and supply of capital funds. They were determined by a governing body as a potent instrument of combating inflation. Inflation is an economic malaise which comes to the surface when the rate of price increases surpasses that of goods and services. If the excess is moderate, it is acceptable, but it turns into a contagion when the excess is great or runs out of control. Inflation can occur during stagnation and also after the stage of full employment is reached. Inflation, like oil price volatility, is one of those things which do not conform to the model of a free market mechanism. The only means of combating it lies in control by a public authority. Unfortunately, in the case of inflation control, the cost to the community can be enormous, particularly if the trade-off is employment and prosperity. In the energy sector, another form of intervention may be relevant. When demand for oil and energy was diagnosed in certain communities as excessively high, a misallocation of resources was spotted by the energy planners. The market price alone, even at its high levels, was not in itself enough to point out the long-term scarcity of oil resources. Moderating factors designed to reduce demand were therefore introduced outside the free market system. Rules and regulations were enacted for setting out certain standards for energy-consuming machines and space accommodations in spite of the consumer's choice. The resulting saving in consumption was a great success, but again, the trade-off was further unemployment and lower production rates. That was due to the time lags resulting from the slow transition of affected industries in their restructuring activities designed to accommodate the new measures. We in Saudi Arabia have suffered a great deal, both at periods of high demand as well as at those of low demand, in terms of revenue, while trying to apply policies reasonably based on market realities. Recent developments should perhaps persuade many oil producers to adopt such policies as we in Saudi Arabia had adopted. OPEC is now seeking price determination policies whose objective is to set the price of an equilibrium course that should, of course, be dynamic, and then to protect this level in a manner which balances supply and demand, thus furthering the course of stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We will have some questions. There are microphones to your left and to your right. We would simply ask that the questions be short and to the point. Is there a question to the left?
There's been a lot of talk that Saudi Arabia will be slowing down its development projects now that oil revenue is down. Does that mean there will be fewer opportunities for Americans to work in businesses in Saudi Arabia?
Well, we are hopeful that our 5 years plan project will be carried out the way we planned. But there will be definitely a delay in the implementation of the various projects. This in itself will reduce to some extent the opportunities, but it won't bring it to an end. The business community in this country will find in Saudi Arabia a good place as a market, as a country where your construction companies can function, and especially for our industrialization plans.
A question from the right.
Sheikh, last night during your meeting with the Arab students, you mentioned that a possible compromise peace plan might be announced next week. Can you elaborate on that?
I do not think that a compromise could be reached in 2 years, in 2 days period. It could be 2 years. But probably in the coming few days, we might hear something from King Hussein to define his position vis-à-vis the administration plan for peace and the possibility of a peaceful negotiation.
How would you feel if the United States were to impose a tax on imported oil, and how would this affect OPEC?
Well, from what we know, that you're talking about imposing a tax on imported oil in order to reduce the deficit in the future budgets, but not very soon. Well, we do fear that it is unfair to the American public to be deprived from the benefits of a lower price of oil. You suffered so much during the last 3 years or so, and the price of oil went up so sharply that you are entitled right now to get the benefit of a lower price of oil, and it should come to the pockets of the consumers rather than the treasury. This is to start with. But I know that there is a difference of opinion right now among the members of the Congress and the Senate and among the members of the administration itself. I just read an interview with the Secretary of Energy which shows that he's not really interested in an import tax at this moment. OPEC does not like to see an import tax imposed, because if the price goes down, then it has to go to the benefits of the ultimate consumers and not the treasuries of the consuming countries.
Mr. Minister, your thesis for control of petroleum, I think, suggests solidarity of OPEC. To what extent does the solidarity of OPEC depend on the encouragement, support, and financing of the petroleum companies and the international banks?
May I have the question? Assume what?
To what extent does the solidarity of OPEC depend on the support, backing, and financing of international petroleum companies and international banks?
You know, we take decisions in OPEC by a unanimous vote, and the price cannot go upward unless we all decide on that. So the solidarity of OPEC, even if it is not attained, will not be an obstacle in the way of a meaningful dialogue between the producers and the consumers. And therefore we think that OPEC, as it is, even without the unanimous vote, can function in order to stabilize the price of oil. However, we also believe that what happened in the last year and this year is a good lesson for some of our OPEC colleagues to understand the market realities and understand that no one can have it his own way.
Sir, as a country whose income is derived mainly through a non-renewable energy resource, does your country see an end to the oil age as we know it? If so, when? And also, what steps is your country taking in alternative energy sources to go beyond that point in time?
What we really have to do is not alternative sources of energy in the first place, but to diversify our revenues. Right now, most of what we get is coming from oil. And sometime in the future, our oil exports will gradually come down, and therefore we won't be getting enough revenues. In this case, we have to diversify our economy, and this is what we're doing. The industrialization plans in Saudi Arabia is something unprecedented in the history of mankind. At the same time, the activities in building the human resources, the universities, and what we're doing, the infrastructure, is another source of diversification. The mineral deposit in Saudi Arabia will be very huge, and Saudi Arabia will become a major exporter of minerals in the world in the coming century. At the same time, the agricultural activities is going ahead. This is what we are interested on. But when it comes to the alternative sources of energy, this is a global problem, and we must deal with it in Saudi Arabia and outside Saudi Arabia. And we feel that what will happen is that we will move gradually from a major source of energy, which is oil, to another period of multiple sources of energy, in which oil is a one source, and then you have other sources like coal, synthetic crude, nuclear energy, and so on. Until sometime in the coming century, we will have a one major source of energy, whether it will be solar energy, fusion, or God knows. But this is way ahead of us. Saudi Arabia is embarking on some research activities in this area, and probably we are the only developing country in the whole world which is investing so much on solar energy. We are the only country in the world where you have two small towns mainly dependent on solar energy for electricity, for heating and agriculture and so on. So we are doing this with our Center of Technology in coordination and cooperation with outside world, especially with the United States of America.
Yeah, I'm a student in political science, and we've been reading a lot lately about the Reagan administration's role or the lack of role in the recent OPEC meetings. And I know that earlier in your speech you addressed the fact that you hope that we would represent our own interests in the Middle East. And I was wondering, what exactly, from your point of view, would you, what stance would you like to see the Reagan administration take? Are you asking for exactly what kind of support are you wanting from this administration?
Well, the Reagan administration believes in a free enterprise system or no control whatsoever. So what we hope to see is no interference in determining the price of oil. Because if you try to push the price downward unnecessarily, there will be very harmful effects even for the American economy. I just mentioned briefly some of it. I did not want to elaborate here something more about the harmful results which might happen to America itself from a very low price of oil. The banking community will be the first victim, and a huge amount of money is already giving as loans to small oil companies who started developing marginal oil fields. And they are not able right now to repay these debts. They are about to be bankrupt. And this means that the small and middle-sized banks will be forced to write off these debts, which means a very harmful result. At the same time, Mexico is a great borrower from 7 major American banks, and their ability to repay is now limited because of what's happening. If you bring the price of oil further down, I'm afraid the results will be extremely harmful. Well, this is for the immediate results. But later on, You don't want to depend on the outside world on imported oil. That's fair enough, and this is why you build your strategic reserve in this country. But if you push it downward, you will become really dependent on the outward. Your strategic reserve will never help you to overcome that unwanted consequences.
Sir, will the power of OPEC in the world be retained if an agreement over oil prices within the countries, if an agreement is not reached?
Well, the agreement is reached as far as OPEC is concerned. But what we want to see is what will happen in the coming week or two from Great Britain. And definitely, one way or another, in the future, OPEC will be the main setter of prices in the world, because we read in your newspapers that OPEC is producing only 14 million barrels a day. It will go to 18 or 20, whatever it is. This represents a small percentage, relatively speaking, from the world production. This is true. But what OPEC is producing is for exports and not for local consumption. You cannot consider what the Soviet Union is producing, the 12 million barrels, and what the United States is producing in the total production. I mean, the effect of what is produced locally is much less than the effect of what is exported in determining the price of oil. So OPEC in the future, sooner or later, will be the main price setters.
I believe that Saudi Arabia has slipped to the fourth or the fifth largest source of U.S. imports of oil. And I was wondering how that is going to affect U.S.-Saudi relations in the future.
I don't think it will have any effect whatsoever, because in this country you know for sure that when your consumption of oil will rise again and increase, the main source of supply is Saudi Arabia. This is number one. And number two, those who are working in Saudi Arabia in the oil industry are the four major American companies. Your interest, or the American interest in Saudi Arabia, is not based on oil only. There are so many major factors which your interest, or the American interest in Saudi Arabia, is not based on oil only. There are so many major factors which deepen and strengthen the relationship between the two countries. And oil is only one of those factors. And today, if there is a reduced dependence, this is only temporary. And in the future, it will come back to what it was in the past.
Okay, Mr. Minister. As I see it, one of the most damaging things that's happened in recent history of the American economy is this increase in the cost of oil. It's caused inflation over here due to the relationship of oil to, say, the plastic production, transportation of goods, everything is ultimately dependent on the price of oil. It's, and especially at its refined stage. And I'm wondering, how long is it going to take before the OPEC countries and everyone else sees that we are a community, and that anything that happens that's damaging to the American economy will also eventually be damaging to the Saudi economy or any other part of the world, as we're seeing happen now? It seems we're taking a very long time to realize that we are indeed a world economy.
Yes. Well, I think I'm in full agreement with your theme, but let me clarify a few points. Number one, the recession in the United States started before the increase in the price of oil. And number two, the high inflation rate in the United States started before the increase in the price of oil. And it was not caused by the increases in the price of oil. As a matter of fact, you import so little compared to what the Japanese, for instance, import. The Japanese import 100% of their oil requirements at a very high price. And compare their inflation rate, which is 3-4% maximum, to the inflation rate in this country, which exceeded the 2 digits, became 2 digits. So the increase in the price of oil is not the cause or the direct cause of the economical difficulties you have in this country, but definitely it contributed to this after it happened. And we are against it in Saudi Arabia. As I said a little while before, we were against it. We fought very hard. We suffered so much from what happened. And we think we should create a system by which both the consumers and the producers will enjoy the stability in the price of oil, so that you don't face a hardship as you did in 1980, and we do not face a hardship as we do right now. We both have a mutual interest. We must work for that mutual interest.
Mr. Minister, you mentioned that the OPEC countries and the oil-producing countries are having a great deal of difficulty coming up with any kind of continuity and agreement on prices. Do you expect that situation to continue to deteriorate, and do you expect that eventually the price of oil might go down to $15 a barrel like you mentioned earlier?
No, I do not expect that. As a matter of fact, I expect the agreement which took place sometime this month in London to be implemented and be successful. As a matter of fact, the consumers depleted their reserves and reached a very vulnerable level. Now, I'm not talking about the United States of America. You are still in a much better position compared to the Europeans and the Japanese. These two areas, Japan and Europe, had reached a very vulnerable situation. If anything happens right now which will interrupt the flow of oil, then we will have a very serious crisis. They might have to shut down some of their industries in these countries. And therefore, companies will start to replenish their inventories. They are drawing something like 6 million barrels a day right now because they anticipate a lower price of oil. When they stop doing that, then you will have an immediate increase in demand, which will increase the share of OPEC in the market. When you have a recovery, and this is already started, the rest of the OECD countries will follow suit, and they will have a recovery because they are linked to your economy. And therefore, you will have an increase in consumption. With the present cut in the price of oil, you will already notice a shift from the consumption of coal to the consumption of fuel oil in certain countries in Europe and probably in Japan. With all these things, in 1984, you will notice a different situation. And gradually we will go into a balanced situation between supply and demand. What we have to avoid, both producers and consumers, is another sharp increase in the price of oil, which will benefit no one.
We'll plan on one more question from each of the two microphones.
Yes. Do you see the Western banking system to shy away from the the high interest rates and maybe adopt a plan where we would not have usury as in your country? In other words, doing away with usury.
The Western banking system is not functioning on its own. The decision comes from this country, from the Federal Reserve, and they decide what will be the prime rate. The Europeans and the Japanese, they hate a high rate of interest, and they want you to lower your interest. So as I said, this is not a result of the supply-demand factor, but it is a government decision. So I don't see an answer to your question. If you tell me, I'll be very happy and grateful.
To what extent is Saudi oil pricing or sales affected by U.S. foreign policy in the Mideast, including such factors as arms sales and such?
I don't see any link between the price of oil and the oil policy, especially when there is a surplus in the market. Thank you.
You've been listening to a lecture by and a question and answer period with Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the oil minister of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, speaking in a series of Landon Lectures and public issues. As you heard, as you listened to this broadcast, the Landon Lecture was started twice. It began first at 10:30 this morning, was interrupted by demonstrators in McCain Auditorium. The hall was emptied, and the lecture began again about 11:45 and continued to its conclusion, which just took place. Our thanks to you and to our affiliates for staying with us through what amounts to nearly 3 hours of waiting this morning, and to our technical crew, to Lynn Parker and Del Staub. This is Ralph Titus, and this is the K-State Radio Network. From McCain Auditorium on the campus of Kansas State University in Manhattan, the K-State Radio Network presents now a lecture by CBS News correspondent Charles Kuralt. Kuralt is the 59th lecturer in this series. He has been with CBS News some 25 years, is best known for his travels across